Hello, my name is Daniel Wang, and I'm a professor of law at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, also known as Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo, Brazil. Before joining Fundação Getúlio Vargas in 2019, I was an assistant professor at Queen Mary University of London, where I taught health and human rights, and I also taught human rights law at the London School of Economics. In this short video, I will present the main points of the presentation I'm going to give in July. My talk will be on the issue of the judicial protection of vulnerable groups during the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has changed the life of virtually every person on this planet, but the impact of the pandemic was by no means evenly distributed. The pandemic and the measures to contain the virus had a disproportionate impact on the vulnerable and marginalized groups who tend to be more exposed to the health, economic, and social impacts of the pandemic, and whose needs tend to be overlooked by the rest of society. In particular, I want to focus on three of the most marginalized groups in Brazil: the indigenous population, the prison population, and the people who live in the favelas in Brazil. These three groups have in common the fact that they are subject to serious deprivation and violence. These human rights violations precede COVID-19, but they became even more salient during the pandemic. Structural claims have been filed at the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the Brazilian judiciary, in order to compel the government to act to protect these groups. It is important to remember, just to give you a bit of context, that at that time, Brazil's president was Jair Bolsonaro, who has proudly expressed his contempt for the rights of vulnerable populations and who is very enthusiastic about police violence. So indigenous populations, they are particularly vulnerable to infectious disease and have more limited access to health and social care services. Not all of the indigenous populations, but certainly those who have limited contact with outsiders, these are more vulnerable to the disease. Moreover, there are violent territorial disputes in indigenous lands due to the lack of a legal recognition and protection of indigenous lands against invaders, for instance, loggers, miners, and farmers. It was then necessary to promote access to public services and to reduce their contact with outsiders by removing invaders from their land or preventing new invasions. The prison population was particularly vulnerable to the problem of due to the problem of mass incarceration. Brazil has the third largest prison population in the world. Mass incarceration is correlated with poor health conditions. And in the case of COVID, mass incarceration made social distancing impossible. It was then necessary to reduce prison population during the pandemic by, for instance, releasing prisoners in high-risk groups or those whose prison were not related to crimes that involve violence or serious threat. The third vulnerable group is the favela dwellers, people who live in the favelas in Brazil. Favelas are the slums where the poorest urban populations live. Favelas, not everywhere, but in some places like in Rio de Janeiro, favelas are also a place where heavily armed police force and heavily armed gangs fight for control. And very often, innocent people, they are the victims of these clashes between the police and armed gangs. People are shot by stray bullets more often than it should be tolerable in a decent society. And with the emergence of COVID, many feared that these confrontations would become more deadly for innocent people because during the pandemic, favelas would be more densely populated as people had to stay at home. Moreover, confrontations would limit the delivery of health and social care services for this population, and these services were badly needed during COVID-19. During the most serious health crisis in living memory, marginalized groups needed special protection, but their needs and rights were at greater risk of being neglected, particularly given the political context in Brazil. For these groups, legal action and courts exercising their counter-majoritarian role was the only institutional option left to challenge the neglect and the violence suffered in those circumstances. Therefore, it is important to understand how the Supreme Court addressed these issues, how the court decided these cases, and if what they did was effective to protect these populations. During the conference in late July, I would discuss these three cases in detail. Was the Supreme Court able to protect these vulnerable groups? Spoiler alert, the answer is probably no. And I think that this is an important case study. Brazil is an important case study to understand the limits of structural litigation to promote timely material change for the most vulnerable groups. So I hope to see you in July. Thank you very much.